Okay, today we're going to talk about the protest that happened this past weekend, among other things, what's going to happen in the future. Now, I titled this conversation as The General Always Smiles, which is, of course, a play on the book The King Never Smiled. That said, it seems how the situation has been developing so far, the general, meaning General Prayut, is always smiling. Now let's go back to what happened on February the 13th. I'm going to take you from that day and also included the protest before February the 13th and then focus zeroing in on the 13th itself, what actually happened, who threw the first punch, and then we're going to move on into how Thailand, the divided Thailand, how society how society received the event of February the 13th, and then move into what is the end game for the Rasadon movement or the pro-democracy protesters. Now, on this past Saturday, February the 13th, pro-democracy protesters gathered at the Democracy Monument. One of their objectives was to call for the release of the four activists, Kun Anand Nampa, Kun Penguin Parit, Kun Somyot, and also Mo Lambank. His real name is Kun Pitiwat. Now, all these four have been charged with multiple counts of lèse majesté. They have been imprisoned and denied bail. So from the Democracy Monument, the protesters then marched to the city pillar shrine near the Grand Palace. Then there was a clash with the police and 8 people were arrested. But 3 days before this event, on February the 13th, protesters also gathered at the MBK Skywalk and around the Patumwan intersection. The police from that event arrested 6 protesters because they were posting signs that the police deemed inappropriate. And then the other protesters marched on the Patumwan police station to demand their release. And of course, there was a clash with the police. And if we go back a little further, there was another clash with the police near the Myanmar embassy a week prior when the Myanmar living in Bangkok were out there protesting against the coup in Myanmar. And of course, many Thai protesters joined in the protest, including the Vivo volunteer guard who used to be the guards for the Rasadon protest movement. So if we look at all these events, there is a recurring pattern that has been developing since the clash in front of the Parliament House last year. This pattern is that the protesters will march somewhere that the police won't allow them to go to. And the protesters will demand something that the police may be able to give them. Like, for example, releasing the 6 protesters from the Patumwan station. The police could do that. It was within their power. Or the protesters may demand something that perhaps is not entirely in the police power. For example, marching on the Grand Palace last year or marching onto the German embassy, but they weren't able to go inside the embassy. However, on February 13th, their plan was to march to the city pillar shrine, right? And the police wasn't about to let them do that because the pillar shrine is holy, is sacred, is Prasayam Tewatirat, is the guardian deity of Bangkok created by His Majesty King Rama IV, representing the Jakri dynasty, and is very near to the Grand Palace. But either way, no matter what happened, whether the police let them or won't let them, from since the beginning of the year, these protests have ended in a clash between the police and the protesters. The question now is who threw the first punch on Saturday, February the 13th, the event from this past weekend. Now, reading through the reports and the eyewitness accounts, this is a summary that I came up with, a summary of what happened. Now, if anyone else has stories to add or a different version, please do. You are welcome to. Um, from Saturday, when the protesters left the Democracy Monument to march on the city pillar shrine, they were there because they wanted to conduct a ceremony symbolic of their movement. So the protesters met with a police barricade, and behind the barricade there were 2 water cannon trucks and riot police, locked and loaded, full metal jacket. Also included were men in plain clothes with haircut similar to mine. So that tells the story that the police weren't going to let the protesters pass. So they ended up in a negotiation. And eventually, the protest leaders was trying to negotiate for the police to let four individuals, four leaders, to get through the barricade to conduct a ceremony at the city pillar shrine. Reluctantly, the police agreed, so all seemed fine. However, there's a group of protesters who weren't happy about this. They wanted everybody to be able to go to the city pillar shrine. So they began to throw rocks and bottles. There were also small explosions from allegedly homemade bombs. There were also alleged uses of ping pong bombs. But eventually the situation then calmed down, and a group of protesters were allowed to conduct their ceremony. Not everyone, just a small group. After everything was done, the protest leaders then called for an end to the protest. Most people went home. So this is how situation normally unfolds for most of the protests last year. The protesters were able to do whatever they wanted to do, and there was a call to end the protest, and everyone went home. However, 2021 is not 2020. So on this past Saturday, February 13th, there were a group of protesters who did not want to go home. These protesters, they were the same faces of protesters that were there earlier in the evening, throwing rocks and throwing stones. In fact, these are the same protesters who were there before 3 days ago, well, not 3 days ago from today, but 3 days ago from February 13th at the Patumwan police station, also throwing rocks, throwing stones. And also, they were the ones who were in front of the Myanmar embassy. When the police show up, everybody else dispersed. But they didn't disperse. They didn't disperse. These are the same people. So they were there, they refused to leave, and the police tried to move in to disperse, and there was a clash with the police. And then the proverbial all hell broke loose. Now, in all this, a homeless man was arrested. Also, a volunteer medic was beaten up basically by the police. Now, if you want to have a look at the video footage of this, I recommend to follow Kun Prayut of Castle English. He was there at the scene, and his camera was able to capture the scene in which a group of riot police bomb rushed this volunteer medic who was wearing a yellow vest of the medic, and they pull him and drag him and pull him and throw him to the ground, and they started to beat him and stomp him with their boots. He was laying there motionless on the ground. Now, obviously, this is excessive use of force by the police. Even if the protesters has thrown rock or thrown stones, if you are the police, you go in there, you arrest them, you handcuff them, you put them in a truck. You do not throw them on the ground and stomp them with your boots. This is not police arrest. This is a gangster beat down. So when as all this happened, this is the protest leaders did not want any of this to happen. Even Kun Rung Panussaya earlier, she was on the microphone begging and pleading with the protesters to not resort to violence. And yet there was this one group that was ready for violence, right? The same group that threw stuff earlier, the same group that was at the one intersection, the same group that was at the Myanmar embassy, the same faces. Now, these are the same faces that reporters are familiar with because we see them at every protest. The same faces that the riot police are familiar with because they have been face to face, jawing at the police at every one of these protests. Yet these same faces manage to repeat the action over and over, while the volunteer medic and the homeless man are still in prison. They both should have been released. They both should be released. They both should file lawsuit against the police. But in theory, they should do that. But of course, this is Thailand. They want to be able to do that. But the point is, there is this group of people who's ready to rumble at every protest. Now, who are they? Some say they are Rasadon guards. But Kun Toto, the leader of the rebel volunteer, insisted that they are the third hand, somebody who's not involved, somebody who's trying to create the situation. Now, be that as it may, this upcoming protest that they're going to have on February the 28th, this coming Saturday, I guarantee you these same faces will be there. So the question will become, will there be another clash, another violence? Now, I'm not saying that all of these clash and violence are started by this group of people. Obviously, the police should not be there in the first place. Riot police, that is. The police who should be there are the normal police to keep peace and order and allow the people to demonstrate peaceably in a democracy. Nonetheless, we are in a situation in which the riot police are there and violence happens from both sides. And obviously, the police abuse their power. They abuse the law. They use excessive violence. What else is new in Thailand? That's also something else that is new. The protesters are playing right into the hands of General Prayut and General Prayut. Because you see, right now society is divided. You have one group of people watching the clips of the volunteer medic getting stomped on. And this group will cry shame on the police. And then you have another group watching the clips of protesters throwing bottles and allegedly bombs or firecrackers exploding. And this group will be crying shame to the protesters. And we have one group crying shame over protesters getting arrested and injured, and another group crying shame over the police getting injured. So this is a scene of social division. And as long as the people are divided, we can't unite against the generals like they are doing in Myanmar and elsewhere. Now, on this coming Saturday, February 28th, that day is the deadline the protesters give to the police to release their four friends, Anon, Penguin, Somyot, and Molam Bank. What can we expect? Obviously, it will be very difficult to get the police to release the four individuals. They are charged with less than just. They have been denied bail. So what can we expect to happen this coming Saturday? More of the same, the repeated pattern of clashes and social media exploding with anger, rage, and hashtags. If that happens, then we are back to the status quo. What is the status quo? It's what's been happening in these past 2 or 3 months. And it's playing right into the playbook of the generals. Because you see, to the generals, we are just the peasants, the pride. So let the peasants, the pride, fight each other, the frontline policemen and the protesters. Keep them fighting, keep them angry at each other. They are pride anyway. Divide and rule. And as long as they are at each other's throat, they'll forget that the first step to removing the power of the generals is to remove the power of the 250 senators. When was the last time we have heard anyone talk about the 250 senators? Now, before I go on, let me put out a disclaimer. Each and every one of those protesters has more courage in that pinky finger than I do in my entire body. After all, they are out there risking lives and limbs and jail time while I'm sitting here in a room talking. But to understand and to analyze the situation, we have to look at it purely from a strategical perspective. And from this perspective, the protesters are playing right into the hand of General Prayut and General Prayut. Again, when was the last time someone talked about the Constitution? When was the last time someone targets the 250 senators? Even the opposition party in parliament barely talk about any of this anymore. It seems that everyone has forgotten about the Constitution and the 250 senators, which was the original demand of the Rasdon movement anyway. Having said that, every demand the protesters make is democratically legitimate, including Section 112, including monarchy reform. But the point is that Thailand isn't going to get to reforming Section 112 or the monarchy without first having a government that's willing to go there. And we are not going to have a government that's willing to go there as long as 250 senators, one third of those with the power to vote for the prime minister, as long as they continue to have the power to vote for General Prayut. These senators, they had the power to elect General Prayut in 2019. They will still have that power in 2023. And if their power isn't removed before the next election, it is most likely that General Prayut will continue to be in charge of Thailand. Now put everything into perspective. He would have been in charge of Thailand from 2014 to at least 2027. That's 13 years. Let me repeat that again. 13 years. First made possible by the coup d'etat. Second, made possible in 2014 because of the constitution, the way the election was designed, and the 250 senators. And now it's going to happen again in the next election if something isn't done with the power of the 250 senators. And if we have 13 years of General Prayut, no real reform is ever going to happen. Misrule and mismanagement will continue. Society, the economy, and education will continue to suffer. Meanwhile, the general's power will be more and more deeply entrenched. How? Well, while everyone else suffers, firstly, the elites will be fine. And also, the generals will continue to shower the military, the police, and the civil servants with gifts. Election canvassers, the Gamnan and Puyai Ban or village heads of Thailand will continue to rely on the patronage of the generals, thereby owing them gratitude and loyalty. The general's power will become more and more deeply entrenched in every single apparatus of the government, from your local village head to the judges of the highest court. How could this be possible? 13 years in power. That's how. And then when the 250 senators seize their power after the next election, it won't likely matter at all because General Prayut will have 13 years to build his power base. And that right there will negate any possibility of any reform anytime soon. We're going to have to wait 10 years, 20 years, if not longer. So the first step for the Rasodon movement, for the pro-democracy protesters, and for everyone who wants democracy, excuse me, I drink out of the bottle. So the first step to prevent this from happening is to focus on the 250 senators and delete their power. Now, Thailand is divided on many issues, especially the monarchy. But if there's an issue that Thailand can unite on, it's this one. 250 senators. Trust me, the silent majority and the non-hardcore royalists agree with this. How do I know? I know them personally. You see, before the new year, Anon Nampa said they need 1 million people in the street. And just last week, Rung Panussaya said they need 2 million people in the streets. But at these recent protests, there are at best a couple of thousands of people, or a few hundreds. In fact, the only protest where people generally agreed that the number went over 100,000 was the Sanam Rung protest on September 20th, 2020. So Arnold and Rung are correct. to affect real changes, to put real pressure on the government, to force the government to do something, they need legions of people in the street. And I will tell you this, in reality, they don't need 1 million or 2 millions, but they do need hundreds of thousands nationwide. Again, how do we get these people, or how do they get these people to come out? There has to be a common cause to unite behind, a common cause that can be realized in short-term reality, something tangible, something people can grab on, something people can look at and say, that is possible. If we unite, that is possible. And because of this cause, we can unite. And once you get this done, then it will lead to other reforms in the future. Again, the protesters have more courage and conviction in their pinky fingers than I do in my entire body. After all, they are the ones out there risking lives, limbs, and jail time. But from someone who has been there since the yellow shirts and the red shirts and the PDRC, the Gopopasol, and from the lessons around the world, from the civil rights movement in the States to Arab Spring, to Euromaidan, to the Hong Kong protests and the protests in Myanmar. We can learn from all of these protests of what works and what doesn't. And one thing we can learn from is that there is value, there is possibility of success if they focus on one clearly defined objective. One clearly defined objective that millions can identify with, that millions can unite behind. Then use this one objective with millions of people uniting behind it and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people willing to put body in the street to make that demand peaceably and democratically. If they have this, then they can pressure the government, hammer it again and again and again and again, delete the power of the 250 senators. And if the protesters succeed in that, then that paves the way to possible election victory, to form a government, a coalition government that might actually be committed to reforms and then to reform everything else. But as long as Thailand cannot find a common cause to unite behind, as long as we continue fighting skirmishes between the riot police and the protesters, fighting skirmishes rather than hit straight at the power base of General Prayut, the 250 senators, then General Prayut can continue to smile and muck about and does whatever he wants. Censor debate or no censor debate. And I know this might offend and hurt the feelings of many people, but monarchy reform, no matter how democratically legitimate, is not the issue Thailand can unite on. The fact of the social division that we see to this day speaks for itself. Don't let fact hurt your feelings. Don't let fact stand in the way of what you have to do. And if Thailand cannot unite, then Thailand loses. 250 senators, I will say it again and again and again. This is something we can unite on. Obviously not everybody, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions, can unite on. The rest of the reforms will come later. And if Thailand doesn't delete the 250 senators' power before the next election, then we will have 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now, when we look back in hindsight, then we will see 13 years, at least 13 years of General Prayut in charge of Thailand. So that's the real first battle. That's the end game of the first battle, is the 250 senators. Okay, that's pretty much all that I have prepared for this talk. Let's have a look at some comment. Kun Pong Thorn, always glad to have you here. Kun Pong Thorn said maybe this third hand was planned by the military to exploit the situation. Perhaps, maybe. Of course, we can't make that accusation without evidence, but I'm sure everybody who understands Thailand, who knows Thailand, can make up their own mind. But again, those people who were there and always throwing rocks and throwing stones, a lot of them, I will tell you honestly, are part of the protesters. And we don't live in a world in which one side is totally right and correct about everything, and the other side is totally wrong about everything. There are good and bad on both sides. And this is one of the drawbacks, the downside of having a leaderless movement. There are many factions and groups that you don't control and, and you can't control because you are not united in one group. Another comment, well, a compliment, Kun Rich Jarvis, I thank you. He said, I really like your videos, Kun Boranai, always concise, coherent, and informative. Keep up the good work. Thank you, I appreciate that. It's not easy doing this live video, even though I love the sound of myself talking, and I've been doing a lot of videos, but the live ones, talking to yourself is always the hardest. Another comment, Kun Thorn, 12 days to convince the public to delete the power of the 250 senators. Actually, not 12 days. Actually, the process of constitutional reform and rewrite, we have 3 years. But it's never going to get anywhere if the protesters does not push the MPs in parliament towards it. And again, it goes back to my point earlier. Nobody is talking about this anymore. People sort of forget about the Constitution and the 250 senators. And when I say nobody, I don't mean literally nobody. It's a figure of speech. Obviously, some people talk about it, but not nearly enough. So they need to change the narrative. They need to rewrite the story, put it back to the 250 senators. Because remember, way back when Penguin and Rung first came out, when people first gathered in July at the Democracy Monument and at Sanam Luang, almost the entire country was inspired, right? It was about that constitution. It was about harassment and persecution of the people. It was about Prayut. The people were inspired. This is something that the country can unite and stand behind. 250 senators, there is nobody in their right mind can defend this. So even those who are on the opposite side, many of them agree with this. Many of them are willing to come out to support the deletion of their power. It's just a matter of how. How do we change the narrative? Or how do they change the narrative? I keep saying we, I don't know why. How do they change the narrative? How do we switch? Again, monarchy reform 112, democratically legitimate, but we have to deal in reality of what we can achieve and the step-by-step process of getting there. The generals are using the divine. Well, the generals always use the divine. And the reason the generals use the divine is because Thailand is a deeply religious and superstitious country. The divine always works in the mindset of the people that dictates our thinking and our action and our behavior. The government, the generals use the divine. The protesters also use the divine. That's why they were trying to march onto the city pillar shrine on this past Saturday. Okay, that's pretty much all I have for this Facebook Live. We try to keep things not too long. And thank you very much for joining. Excuse me today, I'm a little bit sick. My voice is a bit dry and I stumble a bit. Um, Either tomorrow or Wednesday, we'll post another video that I have been promising on a similar theme as today, why Thailand is divided and the general strategy of to divide, to divide, to rule and to divide and to rule, so on and so forth. Um, that will either come tomorrow or Wednesday, and please stay tuned with us. What we do here at Disrupt is we try to explain Thailand. We try to analyze Thailand. We try to form an understanding of why things are the way that they are and how things became this way. Because it is our belief, and I'm sure the belief of many people, that the only way out of a problem, the only way to find the right solution is through critical thinking and analysis rather than yelling and screaming, because that only begets more yelling and screaming and eventually violence, as we have seen time and time and time again. Thailand is in a cycle that it can't get out of. The most important thing is to introduce a new conversation, which a lot of people are doing in both Thai and in English. And I urge everyone to listen and consider those conversations, understanding the why and the how. And then we can move forward to a better future. But most immediately, before I go, let me repeat myself again. 250 senators. Get them out. Thank you.